This is a Moog modular system. It was made in the late 60s, and like I said earlier, it's one of the earliest, probably the first synth ever kind of put together. It's American, and it's just the most warmest, biggest sounding synth I've got, I think. It's got a huge kind of sound to it somehow. Mainly down to the filter, which is here, which is the famous Moog filter. And he kind of patented this design, and it sort of defined the whole Moog sound really for the whole of their history. But this was the first one. And then, so this part of it is the original system. These two rows are modern companies that make the same modules in the same format. Most of them are this company called Synthesizer.com, and there are two sequencers here, and then lots of different sort of processing type modules here that you can, manipulate the sounds of the original oscillators and filters with. And the way I use this is I connect it up with this MIDI interface, which is just a MIDI to CV converter. I send a MIDI clock from my computer out to that, which can then sync all the sequences to my computers there. So I can record a track, like a drum track or something, and then send out the clock, and this will all lock to that clock. I bought this system in about 93, 94 sort of time. It actually came from, there was this guy called Martin Newcomb that had a museum of synthesizers that he built in the early 90s, and he sold it all off at one point. But actually I think I got this through him, but it wasn't part of his collection. But it was through his dealer in America that found it for me. But they were kind of a lot cheaper back then, fortunately. So, but these new modules are actually really cheap to buy. They're kind of, there's something about the early Moog stuff that has become collectible now. So these systems are really quite valuable. But these are still really affordable. These Moog format modules that are being made now. Yeah, I mean the thing is, I'm using mainly controlling modules from the new companies. So they're really the sequencers and the processors rather than the actual raw sounds, which I'm using the original Moog stuff for. So I kind of I've only got one oscillator, for example, where there's sort of 11 oscillators down here from the original system, which sound really, I think, sound better in a way because they've got a more raw, punchy sound. And they're quite, they drift a lot and they're all quite inaccurate, but I kind of like that because you get a lot more kind of interaction in the kind of movement of the sound when things aren't perfect. This is a Roland, a Japanese synth from the late 70s, around about 78 sort of era. So it's a different kind of era to the Moog stuff. And it has a much cleaner, more kind of modern sound to it than the older generation of synths. But it still has a really good character, and the filters and the envelopes are really sort of snappy and really tight. But it does have that kind of Roland sound. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's kind of, all their synths seem to have this kind of similar feel to them, which I've always found quite interesting, that a manufacturer can have a kind of sound. But anyway, it does have that sound. There's sequencers here, there's lots of different filters, lots of oscillators, envelopes and VCAs. And then I've also got two phase shifters, which are really hard to find, these modules. So you can do really nice stereo phase shifting and stuff with it, because there's two of them. It's really good for things like doing oscillator sync, where you can lock two oscillators together and get this kind of sort of really crazy like lead synth sound. These are nice. The sequencers are good, but I like anything with a sequencer because it just brings a whole different sort of dimension to the process, and also I'm not a very good keyboard player, so it helps if you can like automate it all. Okay, so this next one, moving on, is a ARP modular. It's called a 2500. It was made in about 1970, 71, that sort of time. So it was this company kind of came out just after the Moog sort of system was brought out, and they did their own version of it. And kind of, I suppose, because they wanted to be seen as they didn't really want to directly compete with Moog. They sort of did everything in a completely different way. So there's no kind of patch cabling on it. You use these little sliders to make all the connections, and it's a really sort of strange system to get your head around, but it's actually quite, once you kind of get into the way of working with it, it's a really powerful sort of system, and the actual sounds are really brilliant on it. It has a sort of real edginess to it somehow. The kind of character of the synth is really kind of edgy and sort of bright sounding. This I got in about, I suppose, about 10 years ago from a dealer that was selling, he was actually selling two exact systems. Like, I could only afford to get one of them, but yeah, there were two of them, and I think yeah, they were still pretty reasonably priced back then. But it's from a dealer that usually sells kind of mixing consoles and studio equipment, and I think they cleared out a studio, and he had two of these and two Oberheim 4 voices, and I bought one of those as well, so it's pretty cool. Okay, this is a Surge modular. It's another American synth from, I guess it was made in the early 70s, around about 73, 74. And it's, again, a completely different type of sound and different interface to the other modulars. It's got this weird thing where the early modules don't even have any explanation of what anything does. They just have these kind of coded like graphics on them. So sort of inputs are this shape, outputs are square shapes and things like that. And also the nice thing is it uses these banana connectors, so you can stack them all up on top of each other and send sort of one thing to lots of different places, and you start building up these really complex patches that are kind of different way of thinking again to the Moog system, for example, or the ARP. And it has a very unique sound. Again, it's really has a fascinating kind of unique sound to it. Well, the good thing about it is it's sort of all acts as one whole kind of organic unit in a way. You kind of, once you start working on it, you make patches that all kind of interact with itself, and you can just sort of set it up and leave it running, and it will kind of almost create a whole piece of music by itself for you, which is really cool. I actually made this case myself for it, based on a sort of early design that they used to have then, but I put these panels together myself, bought them over quite a long period of time. And actually these are Doepfer modules that I kind of put into a panel to match it. So it's a bit of a kind of DIY job there. All of these synths have CV and gate inputs, so you can trigger it from anything. But it has its own built-in sequencers, which are down here as well. But you can clock them from a MIDI clock or from a drum machine or something. And it's kind of cool when you connect them all together and have them all sort of running at the same time. This is a VCS3, which is an English synth from the late 60s, and I think it's probably the only English sort of modular manufacturer that was around, certainly then. And again, it's got a completely unique way of patching on it. So the actual modules are up here with the controls there, but the way you patch it is with these little pins that you kind of line up one of the knobs to one of the other knobs and put a pin in where they meet, and then whatever you do here will then be being controlled. So it's kind of patching is done with these on this little matrix system. So this thing sounds quite, again, it's quite an organic sound. It sounds like kind of because it's sort of one system working as a whole. It's got a very experimental, organic sound to it. It definitely makes you work in different ways as well when you have these different sort of interfaces for them. So yeah, on this one you probably wouldn't, on the Moog one you probably wouldn't think of doing certain things because you're looking at this little matrix when you're patching, whereas on the Moog you're looking at all these modules in front of you, so you do actually work in a completely different way with it. It makes you approach sound differently. Right, this is a Buchla modular, which is, most of these modules are kind of new, they still make them. And the amazing thing about Buchla stuff is that he pretty much, along with Bob Moog, kind of invented the idea of voltage-controlled synthesizers back in, I think, sort of 1963 or something like that. And he was working on the West Coast and Bob was on the East Coast, and they kind of really thought of the idea together, I mean not together, but at the same time, developed their own systems around the same time. And the amazing thing is that Buchla is still going and still making modules, and a lot of these I bought from him directly last year. So I kind of went over to Berkeley where he lives and met him and sort of bought some modules off him, and we talked through the best sort of system that I could sort of start putting together. There's also some older modules here. This one is a dual oscillator from about 1970, and it sounds really different to the modern oscillators that he has. So with the Buchla system, you got he for some reason split the control side of it up from the audio side. So you need two different types of connector to use it. One is like a jack for the audio, and then the other one is a banana connector for all the control. So the two paths are always kept separate on this system. The system here is basically this new 200 series, but it's got an E at the end of it, 200E, and that means that it's got this idea that you can have preset memories attached to it. So some of the modules, when you turn a knob, it kind of knows where it is and then sends that to a preset manager. And you can do some really interesting things like set up different sort of settings on modules, save it as a preset, and then change all the settings and save that as another preset, and then sort of sequence in between two completely different sort of sound structures. And that's something that he brought in recently when when the sort of processing got available to do that. But the original analog stuff is also really nice. And in between the original and this system with the 200 series, which again I don't actually have any of those modules, but they have their own kind of character as well.